Hello, everyone, and welcome to Delightful Dissent. It's episode 81 today, and I'm joined by Jennifer Jones, the expert writing coach. So thank you very much for joining us, Jennifer.
Thank you for inviting me.
I know it's really, really lovely to have you on the show. And today's assumption, we're going to be talking about the idea that you should wait for inspiration. And I've definitely spent time kind of sat around wondering why it wasn't coming. And I've also kind of tried to go the other way and force things when there wasn't anything. And that neither of them seemed to work terribly well. So I'm really looking forward to getting into this one today. And if you happen to be new to the show, Delightful Dissent is a shared exploration of one of these things that's often taken for granted or given as advice without any further thought. And I hope the show does give you some specific things that you can use in your day-to-day, in your personal and professional life, perhaps. But perhaps more importantly, I hope it gives you ideas about how you can go out there and challenge these assumptions yourself, because I'd like this just to be something that we all do more regularly. And it's delightful dissent because maybe we are, we might be thinking about things differently, challenging some ideas, maybe changing some minds, but it's not about proving ourselves right at everyone else's expense. It's about exploring all the possibilities and maybe having some fun whilst we do it. So this show is genuinely live, so please do bear with us if there are any interruptions or technical issues or anything else that comes up. And please do be aware that we might be there may be some strong language if that's an issue for you, and also that we may be exploring some difficult and personal topics. I think around today's there's nothing too perhaps too difficult, but we're likely to be talking about some things around writer's block, around challenges around self-expression and difficulty getting that out there. And I might talk about that in a neurodiversity context as well. So there aren't any perfect answers here. This is all about exploring and asking questions. If you're watching live, please do ask questions in the comments and we'll try and bring in some of those comments for you into the show. If you're watching the recordings, then we'll be sharing more information about how you can get in touch with us at the end, as well as that being in the show notes. So Jennifer, we first met, we were introduced by previous guest, Ems Ray Searle, and I really loved the conversation we had, and I was particularly struck by your kind of this gentle, supportive approach to getting stuff out into the world, because it can be such a scary thing to do, and there's a lot of pressure around it. So I really wanted to get you on the show to share some of that. So could you perhaps introduce yourself a little bit and describe the work that you do and the people you like to work with, please?
So I am an expert writing coach. I trained to teach writing as part of my PhD in English Lit in California. I've been in the UK since 2007. While I was an academic, so during the PhD and while I was a lecturer after, I had this idea that if I'm a serious academic, my writing's supposed to be hard, and I was an expert at making it that way. My students' writing was allowed to be easy. So they were doing what I now do and what I teach my clients to do, and letting it be easy. And I was just making my life miserable because my writing was up here, my students were down here. Now my clients are up here with me, and we all let it be easy, because writing doesn't need to be nearly as hard as we were taught to make it. So now I work with mostly two groups, business owners who want to write books or blogs or both, and with academic staff, so helping them to write more and more easily.
Super, thank you. And what is it that led you to working with those particular groups of people?
The business owners, I was kind of surprised because whenever I left academia, I set up just as a copy editor, because I've been working doing professional copy editing since 2001. So it was a natural business to set up, but I missed working actually with the writers instead of just the text. But as I set up just the copy editing business, I was shocked by how much writing you have to do just to have a business. You've got to send emails and write blog posts and social media posts, and it's just never ending. And I would go to networking meetings and listen to people, and it's like they have exactly the same problems I had when I was an academic and trying to publish and teach and do all of the things. There are a lot more similarities between the two groups than I think either of them expect. They have both groups have way too much stuff that they're trying to squeeze into the 24 hours we all get every day, and they need to write a lot, and stuff gets in the way. So,
yeah, thank you. I can really see that, actually, particularly for these more kind of knowledge-led businesses. Yes, knowledge-led work where we're consultants or experts of some description or another. It really is very similar to the work of academia in some ways. No, that's really interesting. Thank you. And before we get really into the assumption, though, I always like to ask people to share a quote that resonates for them. So have you got something you'd like to share?
I do. It's from a book called The Right to Write by Julia Cameron. Most people, if they've heard of Cameron, know The Artist's Way and Morning Pages.
The Artist's Way is behind me on the bookshelf somewhere.
I read it. I'll probably never read that one again because I didn't get on with Morning Pages at all. We can talk about that later. The Right to Write, she is looking at how we write and why and what gets in the way. And in the quotation is from the first chapter, and she's talking about what goes wrong about the time we start school. Because if you ask a child to tell you a story, they will just launch into making stuff up. If you ask someone who's been at school for a while or an adult, they're going to want time to sit and think and perfect it. And so she's talking about what school does to us and says, as a result of that, most of us try to write too carefully. We try to do it right. We try to sound smart. We try, period. Writing goes much better when we don't work at it so much, when we give ourselves permission to just hang out on the page. For me, writing is like a good pair of pajamas, comfortable. In our culture, writing is more often costumed up in a military outfit. We want our sentences to march in neat little rows, like well-behaved boarding school children. Burn down the school, save the books perhaps, but get the teacher to tell you the real secrets. What does he write and read as a guilty pleasure? Guilty pleasure is what writing is all about. It is about attractions, words you can't resist using to describe things too interesting to pass up, and forget lofty motives.
Oh, I love that. Particularly as someone who I have a difficult relationship with having the right words, in that I need that. I have a feel for that in a way that's often got me into trouble before. Other people who aren't quite as sensitive to exactly the right word don't always understand and can find it difficult or affected, or but for me it's just like it's not. Yeah, thank you. I really like that. I think that's such a lovely approach. What is it that made you want to particularly share that one around this idea?
I talk a lot with all of my clients about writing not being as hard as we were taught to make it. And before all of the teachers out there object, I know you're teaching mostly to the exam because that's what you're expected to do in our school systems. But that's not what writing is after you leave school. We're not sitting exams anymore. So it is okay just to hang out on the page and just see where the writing will take you. And I think trying to make whatever we're writing take the right form from the beginning is what stops a lot of us. Because we have this idea, okay, I'm going to write a blog post or I'm going to write an article, and you have this idea of what it's supposed to look like. Well, it doesn't look like that at the beginning. It's just a mess that pours out of your head, and then you shape it into form.
Yeah, I think that there's a very common thing for me around the work in general and anything of like, we see the finished article and kind of assume that it has to come out that these things appear in the world perfectly formed, or even close to perfectly formed. And that really isn't the case. It's never been the case for me anyway. I start with stuff all over the place, can change stuff quite radically. Sometimes for me, the act of writing or either writing a piece of for other people to read or writing a talk is that I actually go in a different direction to the one I originally thought. And like, well, instead of because I do a whole load of research and like then I find out stuff and I'm like, oh, actually, I've learned something here. I need to change that bit. That isn't where I thought it was going, and I feel like that idea of us knowing exactly where it ends up when we start. It's I guess, do you think it's partly because when we're taught at school we're always given that this is where you need to end up?
Yeah, and whenever you're being taught to write primarily for exams, your first draft is your final draft, so it has to take that form.
Oh, yeah, that's true too. Yeah.
But then if you read a lot of writing books, and I often go back to the chapter called Shitty First Drafts in Bird by Bird by Anne Lamott. I love that chapter because it gets the point across that the first draft needs to be a mess. My problem with it, though, is that if I were to defecate or vomit on the keyboard, I'm not then going to organize it and make it pretty. And if I started doing that, I hope somebody would take me away and get me some help. So I tend to compare the process to clearing out your wardrobe. The first step is just throw everything on the bed, throw the ideas out, and then sort through them and decide what you want to keep, what you need to fix, and then make it pretty. And I think whenever we remember that you've got these distinct steps, we allow ourselves to take different directions when we get more information or just have time to think. But we aren't trying so hard to make it be perfect from the beginning, because what we're writing is not Athena springing fully formed from Zeus's head. But I think that it's myths, and they do go back that far, that keep writers stuck. We wait for the muses to tell us what to do. And then if the muses aren't talking to us, then we mere mortals, well, that's not our fault. So then we don't have to write.
Absolutely. I think that's, and for me, interestingly, when I do have like, is when the ideas are just there, they're probably the least clear, and they're not something that anyone else would really make sense of. It's, for me, it's more like the unpacking. It's like it's more like it's a suitcase so full that it just bursts open, like distributing stuff all over the room, rather than it being neat and tidy and something that actually anyone else could really make sense of.
Well, and the first draft is for you as the writer. Every draft after that needs to be for the reader, but the first draft is just getting it out however it comes.
I think this is one of the things, this idea of you being the first member of the audience as well, and I that feels really similarly to the way I approach some of this stuff. It's for you first, and it remains for you, and then you bring other people in. And I think this, one of the things that school teaches us is not that we're not really writing for ourselves.
Mm.
It's almost intended to be this difficult, uncomfortable, unpleasant process where we don't have, which is very hard to enjoy.
Yeah. I don't know that I remember ever enjoying writing at school. I know I did a lot of it. Some of my teachers thought I did it well. One of them told me I'd never learn to write well, though.
Interestingly, I was being very wordy. I really struggled with the mechanical act of writing, which led to me becoming really succinct, which helps now in some ways. But I really had to pick my words because I couldn't actually write that many of them physically. And yeah, and I used to get in trouble for not hitting words. It was not a pleasurable experience in any way for me.
And when you've got an arbitrary word count to hit and somebody else's question and purpose, it's just
Yes, absolutely. So to actually really go for the assumption that we're talking about today, which is wait for inspiration. Could you tell me how this kind of shows up for you as an idea?
I find if I'm trying to write and nothing's coming up, it's probably because I haven't created the conditions I need for ideas to come up. So, I like if I'm just trying to do too many things at once. Like, I don't think if I tried to write today, it would go especially well. I am in the middle of moving house and starting lots of big new projects, and it's just there's too much stuff going on. So I wouldn't be able to sit down and just pour words on the page. It's just not going to happen. To create the right conditions for me, I need to be taking regular breaks where I go do things that aren't trying to write, basically. A lot of my good writing days happen after I have a walk along the seafront. Um, Walking comes up a lot with writers. Um, you expect it with poets. They need the rhythm to be able to think through the meter of what they're writing. Tennyson loved walking all over the Isle of Wight, but you also get both George Eliot and Dickens walked all over London thinking through their plot lines.
I think
And
Darwin had a regular walking practice.
yes,
Darwin, when he was writing on the origin of the species,
yes.
I don't have regular. This is one of the things I'm always I really like in actually digging into this stuff is there's yes, it's partly school, but there's actually quite a lot of pressure. Even like there's a lot of people telling you, you need to sit down and make yourself write. And like if I look at all of the people I admire who wrote really, it's like they all had these practices where they actually didn't spend that much time writing,
Mhm.
but they spent a lot of time doing stuff around it that meant what they wrote was really valuable. And the idea of like, and also the idea of like getting up early, people are, I think, morning pages didn't work for me either, partly because I don't do very much stuff in the morning. The idea of having to do something before like another thing to get ready for the day doesn't really work very well for me. And when I look at the practices that people had, it's like they aren't really like they aren't get up at 5 a.m. and write 1,000 words. They're the opposite of that very often. They're like, walk for a bit, talk to someone, write a few letters to, correspond with someone interesting, then write.
Yes, and having time for life around the work, we seem to have lost track of that. Um, with the morning pages thing, my problem, I never did try to make myself do them in the morning. The writing is not going to happen in the morning. I know that there are people in the world who get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and write, but
And if
I
it
will never
works for
do
them,
that. Yeah,
if it works for you, brilliant.
yeah.
If it doesn't work for you, don't worry. I think is my feeling on that.
But my real resistance with the morning pages was she's pretty prescriptive about the 3 sides of A4. And telling me how much I have to write, that's just not gonna happen. I get on much better with, Peter Elbow's free writing, where you set a timer for 5 minutes and you just write whatever comes into your head for 5 minutes. For some reason, putting a time on it instead of number of pages works better for my brain.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, me too. It's a space thing rather than a like writing to a goal.
Yeah. But I think with writing advice generally, a lot of it comes across as very prescriptive. I have recently reread several books about helping academics to write because I'm working with a new group of academics, and A few of them are finally realizing this: you must write at the same time every day in the same place, and that will somehow produce lots of words. Um, all of that comes from a study done by, I can't think of his first name. Surname is Boyce. I can't, and I think he was in America, but he did a study where he had a workshop with some academic writers and then split them into three groups. One group was told just to keep doing what they'd been doing. Another group was told to write down how long they wrote every day. And a third group was told to write down how long they wrote every day, and he would check on them periodically. And lo and behold, the group that was supervised carried on with working. But then it starts to feel very managerial, and none of them were happy writers.
It's also
And
that's like the psychologist in me is like that's just an experimental demand characteristic. You can't like you can't extrapolate anything other than from that than other than if someone is checking in regularly on you for a period of time, you're more likely to do something, particularly if it's an experimenter and you're an academic.
that one experiment influenced years of research around how academics write, and I think damaged a lot of us. And in a book called Air and Light and Time and Space, which is a quotation from a poem by Helen Sword, she talks about this and she says, there are a few people in this world who can be told you need to write for 2 hours every day and they will just do it and it works for them. Most of us, though, she said, it starts to look like, and we use language like boot camp or devotional language like you're in a monastery. She said, if you don't have a drill sergeant or a mother superior telling you every morning you have to do this thing, it's not going to happen. And most of us don't want to live our lives as though we were in boot camp.
The other question for me is like, are we actually going to produce writing that anyone else wants to read?
Uh-uh.
Because one of the things I've really noticed in this whole thing of is there is a real close link for most people. Again, some people seem to be able to do this, but for most people, is how they feel when they create anything tends to transfer over to the person when they engage with whatever that is. So the reader, listener, whatever. So if we're making ourselves really miserable and it's really hard going to write, it's probably going to be miserable, hard going to read as well.
Yeah, I've been blogging for a while, and whenever I look back, just knowing when hard things happened in my life, at the blog posts that I made myself write anyway, those are consistently the worst ones. I need to go back and rewrite some of them, but it's going to have to wait till I'm not moving house anymore.
I think it's interesting, and those things are interesting as a record. You know, it's one of the interesting things about a blog, and one of the things I think, and one of the other things around this actually is this need to be an answer, to be the finished article. Whereas one of the things I've come to realize is a lot of the value of particularly these more longitudinal styles of writing or sharing anything are because people follow you on the journey. They learn from your own like progress and how you've learned because they relate to you. And that's actually a big part of the value. So hiding all of that and being like, and just jumping straight to the conclusion doesn't really help people that much.
And the remembering the journey the reader's on with you, all kinds of writing, whether it's a book or a blog, is just you joining a larger conversation. And if we remember that, we take a lot of the pressure off because you don't have to be the expert.
Mm.
There is no single expert. I didn't expect to find so many business owners with that worry. I expected it always from academic clients because you must make an original contribution to your field. Okay, well, my PhD was on George Eliot. Lots and lots and lots of things have been written about Middlemarch. Trying to make a truly original contribution on that If you let that hang over you, you don't write anything. And I didn't for a couple of years. But so I expected academics to have that hang up because it's sort of built into the system. Business owners too, though, but if I'm a consultant who helps people manage pain without drugs, there are lots of others out there and they've written lots of stuff. So how's what I'm writing any different? And they have the same, it's different language, but the same issue of trying to come up with the answer. And then I find myself saying repeatedly, well, your readers want to know what your answer is. It doesn't have to be the answer for everybody. But the trying to remember that as writers is hard.
I think it's one of the big things, particularly working with neurodivergent people, and in my own experience as well, is that effort to make it worthwhile or make it original. For me, actually, masks a lot of the real originality. So I have an inherently different way of seeing the world. I just have to figure out how to say it out loud in a way that other people are going to understand, not to make it original. And I think that's in some ways, it's a very different challenge. And I think, this idea of like, oh yeah, this is how I understand the world. And that's what I'm doing. I'm conveying my perspective, my experience, my understanding of how things are, rather than like in that moment coming up with something completely like new and spontaneous. And it will be if you let yourself do that, but you can't intentionally make it happen somehow.
Well, it's like what Cameron was saying in the bit I read. Writing is better when we don't try so hard. And if you try to make it be something, it's going to do anything else, but it's not going to do that.
Yeah, I think that idea of letting it be what it wants to be and supporting that, developing that. Yeah, completely. That's a really interesting approach. It's a difficult approach, I think, for a lot of people because it's so different from what we're trained to do. I think, one of the interesting things, and this is maybe slightly less of a problem for people who work for themselves, but where people work with other people, how do you find working with that, where there are expectations, where a manager or a head of department or whatever has an idea about what you should be writing and how you should be writing it? How do you find, how do you help? Is there anything you can do to help people work with that?
You do, and I mean, if you're employed, you are eventually going to have to write the thing that your employer wants you to write. That doesn't mean the first draft has to be what they think it needs to be. And that goes back to let the first draft be whatever it needs to be, and then shape it into what they expect for the final. That is probably never going to be your most pleasurable writing, but it is writing that you can do. And it's really hard to deal with other people's opinions about our writing. So finding ways to talk to, whoever is going to be looking at the thing that you have been asked to produce, finding ways to talk to them about why you've produced it as you have, get it as close to what they expect as possible, but then find out why they think it needs to be the way they think it needs to be. I know those conversations aren't always possible, but if you can have those conversations and ask, well, why do you think it needs to be in this shape instead of that one? You might find that they've just been influenced by what their past was, and they don't actually have a reason for why they think you need to write what you need to write the way they've asked for it. And I think that unpacking some of those assumptions and figuring out where they're coming from and why they're there, if they won't budge on them, at least if you understand where they're coming from, you might be able to work with it better.
It's easier to meet. Yeah, I feel like that's with so much of this stuff is we tend to conflate what we're trying to do and how we're trying to do it. And particularly with something as personal as writing, we're going to do that quite differently. And again, if we use language differently, if we're from a different cultural background and so we use language slightly differently, or if our brains work differently and so we use language slightly differently, we're going to do that a different way, probably. And to try and use someone else's method is going to be harder than, and probably less successful, actually, than going our own way and using language our own way. I really do feel like, part of this, on some level, waiting for inspiration feels a little bit like waiting for the right answer, in scare quotes. This idea of there being a singular right way to convey something, particularly when we're dealing in this more factual space. I think there's this, there's a perfect way to explain something, a perfect way to capture something, and searching and really not proceeding until we have that.
If we wait too long, we tend to start piling on the pressure. I am never far from crayons and unlined paper that's not white. If I find that I've been waiting for a long time to think of what I want to write, and I've gone for the walk by the sea, I've well rested and hydrated and all of that, then I turn to the crayons, because if you write in a way that looks and feels like play instead of like work, you aren't going to be so judgmental about what you're doing. Yes, I realize if I were in an office building instead of my home office, I might feel a bit daft getting crayons and yellow paper out, but I would just tell people that's my process and it needs to happen. The unlined paper and making sure it's not white paper is so that it doesn't look like anything you've ever done schoolwork on. Because if you're writing unlined paper in black ink or blue ink or pencil, some part of your brain is going to go back to this is going to be judged. Where your brain knows that if you are writing a purple crayon on yellow paper, that you have never handed that to anybody for any kind of judgment, it will let whatever's in there come out. And you will happen upon the right way of saying something or the right approach to a problem. But you won't be trying to force it into shape because you know the final shape's not going to be on that bright paper.
That's really interesting. And I've come to I suppose, a slightly similar method. I use dotted paper and I write, when I'm working this stuff out, I write in landscape rather than portrait.
Yeah. And
in funny chunks all over the page and draw lines around it. And because that's how my brain works. It's closer to, and I feel like, there's no way I've never been asked to formally present any writing like that. And it does free you. You're right. Absolutely right. Yeah.
But it can also feel a bit silly the first few times you do it. It's like I'm supposed to be writing, not drawing lines and coloring.
Yeah. I think this idea of when this idea of not having inspiration can feel really hard is when we've got it's that, okay, I want to produce this and I need to produce this by this time. And I spent a long time writing thinking, well, this means I have to write N number of words a day. I don't write that way. My work is largely non-linear, and I kind of fill up all the ideas and then it all comes out quickly at the end. That's basically how I approach everything. To some degree, it's an ADHD trait, but it's also partly just, ADHD is also associated with creativity. A lot of people who have creative practices have some of these traits at least, if not full-blown. I think dyslexia as well. And I think my push to have where I'm like, okay, I need to fill things up. It's one of the other things is I really struggle to write if I'm not reading. It's almost like an input output thing. it's,
Mhm.
and I remember I'm half remembering a quote I came across a long time ago, which was like, that not every voracious reader is a good writer, but every good writer is a voracious reader. And I feel that, if we're not giving ourselves the input, yeah.
We need to sort of swim around in the words before we start trying to use them. But going back to the writing n number of words per day, I discourage using word count as a motivator because it can be motivating if you're committed to writing a messy first draft and you're getting lots and lots of words out. But then when you have to go back and edit and you're cutting hundreds of words a day, it's almost physically painful. So if your goal is always adding words, then editing's never easy at the best of times, but it becomes so much worse because you're taking away those words, so you're undoing the work. And yeah, trying to most of us can produce 500 words in a day, but trying to hit 500 words because that's some sort of goal, they're not that's forcing the issue too much, and you're gonna end up with a lot of words that then have to be cut, and then, yeah, it hurts.
Mm. I think the editing thing is another big barrier around this, and maybe why we can get blocked on this. One of the things I've found is going through and editing is I keep snippets where I frame something really phrase something I really like, but it doesn't fit in this particular thing.
Mhm.
It's like because you don't want to get rid of it completely. It's still a value, and I do revisit them. I don't think I've ever used one completely verbatim, but I've definitely used like the point and some of the structure, and I just find it easier to work with something than nothing sometimes as well.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I don't delete anything. If I'm working on document X, I have cut and paste X as a separate document. And so anything that I don't think belongs in what I'm working on gets moved over
Hmm.
because we do change our minds, and you don't want to waste a week trying to remember. I had the perfect paragraph, and then I deleted it, and it's gone, and you're never going to rewrite it.
There's nothing worse than trying to go back over something old from my brain. It's like, oh, it's horrible. Like I can't, like going over an idea that's already been, no. And then I make mistakes, and then I have to go over it again, and
Mhm.
then again, and oh no, and then I just give up on the whole thing.
It's my self-editing process has gotten a lot easier since I split it into two. The first pass is just deciding, does this chunk of text belong in this thing roughly here? And the second one is what most of us mean by editing, going through and making the sentences flow and fixing the punctuation and spelling and so on. But trying to do all of that at once is just too much. And your brain will just say, it'll just stop. It's just too much input and we're done.
Yeah, there's I think understanding that editing for sense is a very different process to um well, I suppose the copy editing bit of like making sure that you've used the right punctuation and you've not got typos and things like that. I think for me, they're different bits of the brain. I can't really do the latter one very well either. Certainly with text I know I've written. I need a lot of time to be able to spot things in that. But the sense editing, yeah, is a very different thing. And trying to do the two together never worked for me anyway.
For the copy editing, it's actually impossible for any of us to copy edit our own work because our brain will read what we meant to write,
Uh,
whether it's on the page or not. If most bloggers aren't going to send all of every post to an editor, so sometimes text has to go out into the world without a second pair of eyes. Have your computer read it to you. Both Google Docs and Word have a text to speech. and follow along. You will hear mistakes you don't see, or read it out loud to yourself, because for some reason, if we're reading the text as a script, we're more likely to say all of the words than if we are reading it silently. And
Use,
anyone who's, like, given a conference paper knows this. I always found typos in my conference papers, and it's just
use a
but I
completely different part of your brain. Like
does, yeah.
verbal speech comes from a really quite different part of your brain than written language. They're like, yes, there's something common under there, but it's quite a long way under there, and you use a different, and the different bit will go, no, that other bit was wrong.
Or you can read from the last sentence to the first, because then you have to think about the act of reading, so you're more
Ooh.
likely to. Yeah, I
Yeah,
hate doing that way, but
yeah,
if you're somewhere where you can't, have headphones and
yeah, yeah. You can't do it out loud.
yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. I can't think of anything. I don't know why. Something that sounds really. Dude.
It is a bit like fingernails on a chalkboard kind of thing.
But yeah, interesting. Yeah. So if someone is, struggling to do this, either struggling, kind of feeling that they're waiting for inspiration, or perhaps finding that they're writing with no pleasure at all, that it just feels like a chore and something they have to force themselves to do, but that they're professionally expected to do it in whatever way. How could you start working with that? How could someone start engaging with that?
I think when you're not feeling connected to the writing and it just does feel like a chore, that's about as much fun as taking out the bins. Um, you need to reconnect with why the thing is being produced. So go back and look at, who is the audience for this? Why do they need it? And why am I the one who needs to give it to them? And if you start asking those questions and, who your audience is, what they're expecting and what they need, what they expect and what they need are often different things. They think they want one thing, they really want something else. And whenever you start looking at those questions, then you remember why you thought you were interested in this field to begin with. But yeah, I think a lot of the time, whenever you feel like you just don't have anything to say and there's no point in trying to say any of it, it's because you've forgotten who your reader is.
I personally, I find I struggle with an abstract idea of audience as well. It actually helps me to have a conversation with someone, whether they're kind of imaginary or half imaginary. But I really need to have a conversation with any of this stuff. I do it when I'm writing. I do it when I'm doing talks. Is like I ask a question. It might be a rhetorical question. It might be a consider yourself question because it's too big a group of people to actually have a real but it starts off that conversational element. I think that for me is definitely yeah. I think that's really helpful, that idea of getting clear. Do you have any ways you particularly like to do that?
Well, the way I outline makes writing like having a conversation on the page. So when I outline, I make one statement about the point I'm wanting to make. To British audiences, I call this a statement of argument. For American audiences, this is what your Comp 1 teacher called a thesis statement. But you don't want to call something a thesis to a British audience because then they think you're expected to write one. So you write your statement of argument, and then you list all of the questions you're going to have to answer to convince your reader that your statement is true. And then writing your draft is just answering the next question. And as Matthew and I are proving, we can ask and answer questions all day. And, that's not an issue. It's when you start trying to put it on the page that it can become an issue. And if you get really stuck, use a dictation app and actually have the conversation with yourself. If you feel a bit stupid doing that, just hold your phone up and talk into the dictation app. It'll look like you're having a phone call.
And there's a couple of apps, I know Google Keep does automatic transcription and saves it all in notes, which is a really useful tool. That I think it used to be, when I started doing like, well, actually this came from an assistive technology place, but when I started doing that 20 years ago, the tools to do this were really specialized and expensive. Barely anything even had a microphone to speak of that would work properly. And then you'd have to buy some really expensive software. Now it's built into so much that we do. It's built into operating systems. It's built into, it might not be like the very best in the field, but it's good enough for a first draft. Yeah. If that works for you. So I think finding those tools is definitely there's a lot more built into stuff than we think now.
Yes, and I didn't know that about Google Keep, but that is so useful because that's on most of our phones. And I feel sorry for all of those 19th century writers who would go walking for inspiration. If you're walking the up and down fields in the Isle of Wight, chances are it's raining. It's not like you can take a notebook with you. Now we can just take out our phones and make a note without even having to type on the stupidly small keyboard. But also, if you're at your computer, both Google Docs and Word have, I've already talked about the text to speech. They will both do speech to text. It doesn't learn quite as well as an app like Otter.ai. That one is much more accurate, but no, the speech to text technologies come so far recently.
Yeah, it's to the point that it's definitely usable. And I think both Windows and Mac desktops or laptops have it built in so you could use any app actually. And I think this is another one of them, and this is a slightly tricky area because I know it's very easy to get bogged down in tools and tooling. But do you have any kind of more, perhaps rather than specifics, like general principles, things you like? Because so much of our writing is digital. How do you work with the writing by hand, writing digital? Do you have any particular tips or things people should look out for in there?
If the medium you're using isn't working, do something else. I do most of my writing at my computer in my office. If that's not working, step one, switch to laptop, change rooms, or go to a cafe. If that doesn't work, get rid of the computer and take out a notebook. If that doesn't work, add lined paper and crayons. And you just keep stepping further and further away from the professional digital environment until you get to one that's going to let the stuff out. I know some writers who will still write entire books longhand. I can't personally read my handwriting a lot of the time, so that's not useful.
I find my handwriting it just adds a bit of creativity to the editing process, because sometimes it's like what did I'm sure that's what I meant.
But sometimes I do need to switch to longhand to sort of get through the block, and then I can go back to the keyboard. But I think with all writing issues, if what you're doing isn't working, do something else. And we forget that. I get very stubborn about, no, I should be able to do this at my computer. I think it was June this year, I wanted to write a list of 25 reasons why you need to write a book. So I would have 25 topics for blog posts. And I tried for weeks to try to do this, and it wasn't coming. And then finally, one of my clients actually said, "What would you tell me to do if I were struggling to do that?" So get your crayons and go outside. So I took my crayons out to the garden, and I had my list in 20 minutes that I'd been basically hitting my head against the desk for 3 weeks.
I think that's stopping and taking a different tack. It's so we learn almost that we're not allowed to do that. It's almost like maybe even cheating something like that, it's just not allowed, that we can do that. And it it feels like also, one of the things I found is like, if I'm trying to write and I'm sleepy, if I take a nap and then write, it works better than trying to force it. And I get more, it's like, if you've got an hour and you're tired, if you've got an hour to write and you're tired and you take a 20-minute nap, you'll get more words done and better words done in that 40 minutes afterwards than if you try and force yourself to write for 60 minutes. And it sounds like something similar there with like, if you try and force yourself to the final product, then and you lack that kind of playfulness and the exploration, it's like you need to give yourself that.
Yeah.
I think one of the other things I found, and I don't know whether to be interested to know, because I am quite sensitive to sensory things, so that might be partly like, is give yourself nice writing tools that you like using. If you write longhand, find a pen that you like and paper that you like, that feels nice, that works for how you physically write. If you write on the computer, get a keyboard that you like. Even a laptop can have a separate keyboard. You don't have, it's like, get a comfortable writing experience. Actually really, really helps with that, and kind of separates, almost like this idea of writing as punishment. I feel like, and schools, they teach it like, what are lines if not writing as punishment? It's like this idea that writing should be punishing. The more we can step away from that, I really love that, as a core message, I think, to this, the more we kind of don't have to force it. It kind of flows, it comes to us when we need it, rather than having to push all the time and not enjoy the experience. There's something almost taboo about that, about enjoying the process of writing somehow. And I remember the horrible pens I had to use at school as well, which were really like the paper that was like, like cheap, just like, recycled. It kind of reminded me of recycled toilet paper, and a horrible scratchy pen that just, ugh. And there's something about giving ourselves the right tools to use. And I don't mean like necessarily spending a fortune on them, but just finding ones that work for you, you enjoy.
I will come back to that, but I'm going to go back to the nap briefly. Naps are great for writer's block because your brain keeps working on the problem while you sleep. Everybody wins.
Idea consolidation.
And that's why we often wake up with good ideas. Keep a notebook by your bed, because if you wake up with an idea, write it down before it goes away, because it will go away. But the yes, making writing pleasurable. The hardest part about writing is starting. So I always encourage my clients to come up with a simple writing ritual that they like. It could be putting on a scarf, lighting a candle, something that makes their environment inviting, and that signals to the brain, now it's time to start writing. It works the same way as like the sleep rituals, which most of us have heard of. And you need to do the same thing in the same order to tell your brain it's time to shut down for the night. But also at the end of it, the first thing I do with my clients is have them come up with the list of how they're going to reward themselves, both for, if their aim is to keep 3 10-minute writing appointments with themselves in a week, a reward at the end of each 10 minutes, even if all they wrote was about why they couldn't write that day. And a reward at the end of the week for keeping the 3, and at the end of the month for keeping it every week for a month, so that you have rewards at different levels built into every step along the way, because then that's telling your brain, oh, writing doesn't have to be horrible and painful, because we're not stupid. If writing is horrible, you're not going to do it again. Your brain says, nope, last time we did that, you ended up in tears, there were broken crockery, no, we're not doing it again. And it's like, you touch a hot stove, you know not to touch it again. If writing hurts, you know not to do it again. So have rewards built in, but also make the beginning easy. And you'll be more likely to do it because you might actually enjoy it.
Absolutely. I think that's a really good place to start wrapping up, actually. I think that's, as a as a summation of. I love that you've managed to do, sum up an hour's slightly meandering conversation so succinctly. I think it speaks to the practice and what you can do with this kind of thing. So thank you. I think that's really, really good, and I hope it does inspire people everyone out there to go out and start doing a bit more of this stuff and sharing their perspective, because everyone's perspective matters. It's valuable, and skillfully conveying that is a gift to yourself and the world. So if people want to get in touch with you, we've got your website and your LinkedIn in the show notes. Do you want to say anything about either of those? Anything, what can people find there? How would you like people to get in touch or engage?
Well, on the website, if you click the contact me link, it will give you my email address. I welcome you to email me. But there's also a link where you can book a quick chat. I don't do sales calls, so I don't think you're going to get into a hard sales thing. It would just be me asking, so what brought you to my site? What are you writing? What issues are you having? I have, I hope, organized the site so it's easy to find what you're looking for. The author link is going to take you to my books, my blog posts, and so on. The speaker page doesn't have my new YouTube channel on there yet, but it will have soon. The new YouTube channel is called Wardrobes and Writing, and all of the videos on there so far are about how to write a book. So you can hear a bit more about my practice there, but yeah, either message me on LinkedIn or on my website.
Super. Yeah. And I want to say I have tried the search on YouTube, and if you search for Wardrobes and Writing, you'll find your channel first, as well as a lot of videos about wardrobes.
Yes.
Which I was surprised at how many there were. I mean, I do know how much is uploaded to YouTube. It's but just the amount of videos just about wardrobes, still, interesting. So, and if you're worried that your writing is going to be boring to the audience, remember just how many people are uploading videos about wardrobes and are getting a lot of views.
Well, it's really mesmerizing. I had TikTok and watching videos of people folding things. I almost never fold my clothes, but it's mesmerizing to watch.
Yeah, it's very calming to see other people doing something like that. I never will. Yeah. So super. Thank you. So are there any other resources? You mentioned The Right to Write by Julia Cameron. Do you want to say anything about that, or are there any other things you found helpful to people?
The Right to Write, at the end of each chapter, I think she calls them invitations, and she gives you a different exercise to do, or no, an initiation tool. She gives you a different exercise to do related to the chapter. So if you pick this book up, if you read no other chapter, read the chapter called The Well. It's where she talks about artist dates. And that's basically take yourself for a walk, go to a gallery, do something for you to feed your inspiration and creativity. Other than that, at least the chapter called Shitty First Drafts in Bird by Bird, just to remind us that all first drafts are messy. Your first draft's only job is to be done. It doesn't have to be pretty, and it doesn't have to make sense to anybody but you.
And perhaps not in my experience, perhaps not even me in the first
It doesn't have to make perfect sense to you.
It's good. There's got to be something there. I think that whole discovering as you write thing works really well for me. So yeah. No, that's amazing. Thank you. I really appreciate this, and I hope everyone in the audience has found it as useful as I think it's given me some inspiration and ideas as well. So thank you so much for being on the show.
Well, thank you for having me.
And yeah, I hope that did get you thinking in the audience. So please do reach out if it did, and get in touch. It is the audience that makes this possible, or legitimizes my excuse to talk to interesting people doing wonderful things. So if you found it useful, please do share it with someone else, who also might find it that way. You can find upcoming and past episodes both on YouTube and LinkedIn. as well as some more stuff about my work on matthewbalringer.com. The next episode is going to be, well, I'm going to be talking to Solène Anglaret, who is a storyteller, entrepreneur, and artist. And we're going to be talking about the idea of negative emotions. And I think this is, we talk about emotions in a slightly odd way culturally, and I found that staying away from the so-called negative emotions was not a helpful thing in any practice, including in my writing and creative practices, interestingly. So that's going to be at 1 p.m. UK time on Wednesday, the 9th of November. So I very much hope to see you then. But in the meantime, please do go out there and make some delightful dissent of your own. Thanks and goodbye.